You've done many other things. Most importantly, now you're director of the Freeman Spogli Institute. Thank you so much. It's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of talk, a lot of current events. So really appreciate your being here. Very good insights. So thank you, Mike.
Well, most importantly, I'm the Peter and Helen Senior Fellow, Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And a lot of you don't know this, but Hoover rescued me when I went 0 for 23 in the job market. My first time out in the year 1991. 0 for 23. I got one place that offered me a job talk, UC Santa Cruz. And when they learned I was living in Moscow, they said they didn't want to pay the airfare. But I came here on a fellowship that year, the following year, and I've been affiliated with Hoover ever since. And good to be back. It's good to be here. But I don't want to actually talk about what I've been asked to do. I'm going to, but I don't really want to for a couple of reasons. One, I'm not an expert on sanctions. I want to make that crystal clear. I'll tell you a little bit about this group that I've been coordinating, but being the coordinator of a group does not make you an expert. That's the first thing. Two, I am not an economist, and sitting across from John Taylor makes me extremely nervous to talk about anything regarded to economics. But we have a lot of expertise in this room, and I'm hoping you guys can help us rather than me inform you. And I'll tell you very specifically where we need help in a minute. But let me start by just talking about the working group that I coordinate, some initial observations as somebody not expert in this literature, although I've learned a lot, and some things I've rethought from my last big sanctions experience, which was about Iran. When I worked in the government, I was very involved with the Russia piece of Iranian sanctions, and there's some things that I think we got right then and we're getting wrong now, and there's the opposite. Some things we got wrong then that we're getting right now. And I'm really interested, looking around the room and on the screen, for what people might think the implications of this experience so far, first 10 months, what it might be if, God forbid, there is a threat of war or actual war to take Taiwan. And I've thought a lot about those kinds of comparisons, but not very expert on the Chinese economy or the global economy within which China is integrated. So to back up a little bit, I've been involved in Ukrainian matters for decades. I know Russia better, and I'm more associated with Russia, but I've been going to Ukraine since the 90s, published a book in 2006 on the Orange Revolution, and through training programs we have here at Stanford, mostly at FSI, and I see Larry Diamond's here. He's very involved in these. We've had, I would say, we're up to a couple hundred alums of our various training programs, and these are kind of mid-career Ukrainians, activists, journalists, MPs. Former Prime Minister was here last fall, and as a result of that network, when Putin invaded Ukraine, like anybody with any friends, I see Ambassador Pfeiffer there. He's a former ambassador to Ukraine. He has more relationships with Ukrainians than I do, but you felt like you had to do something besides just talk about it among ourselves. And some of us in this community of Americans, Ukrainians, Russians, even Europeans, started to have Zoom calls about what could we do to inform the debate about sanctions. And then the government of Ukraine became very interested in that, and Andriy Yermak in particular, he's Zelensky's chief of staff. We hosted them here about a year and a half ago, President Zelensky, Yermak, the whole team. And they don't have a sanctions team in their government. By the way, talk a little bit more about ours. I've learned a little bit more about it. I'm interested in how we might better restructure our government to do that. So they de facto asked us if we would generate ideas in close interaction with them. Now, close interaction with them is a pretty problematic sentence for the United States government and for me personally, because I did not want to have to register under FARA, or an Agents Registration Act. And I have tried very hard to stay on the south side or left side or right side, whatever it is, of the line where I would not have to do that. I've learned a lot about that world too, which is rather strange because the line's not very well defined, and I can't just call somebody up and ask, am I doing the right things or not? I think that would be a good thing we should perform. But as a result of that, we have this very, I would say clunky structure, which is that I coordinate, I don't chair, the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions, which is comprised of non-governmental officials, many former government officials like Pfeiffer, but nobody in that group is working in any government, including the Ukrainian government. In Ukraine, however, Yermak, the chief of staff, and he's more than a chief of staff, by the way, he's the number 2 most powerful guy in Ukraine. Are we on or off the record? I should be careful.
On the record.
On the record, okay. And I'll say allegedly he's the second most powerful person in the country. I'm not an expert on Ukrainian domestic politics, but he's a very influential person. He's wanted us to be closer and closer to them. And if you read the Ukrainian press, you'll see our group described as the Mike McFaul. But whenever I talk about it, especially when I'm on the record, I want to be clear that we do not have any formal association with the Ukrainian government, or the Russian government for that matter, and we try very hard to keep that I do personally, because we don't want to. We put out what we think is right, and sometimes the Ukrainians agree with us, sometimes they don't. By the way, I'll tell you about some of those if you're interested. And that's the same with the American government, the Canadian government, the European Union, et cetera, right? So that was the origins of this group. We've now published 10 working group papers. They're up on our website, on the FSI website, if you want to see them, in English and Ukrainian, by the way. And I'm not going to try to summarize them all now, but we can bounce around for what you're interested in. But let me just say 3 things in closing about what I've learned and where I think we're at with sanctions. The first question, the one that everybody usually starts with, have sanctions on Russia achieved their goal? And the answer to that is, of course, no, because I define the goal of sanctions as stopping Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Others have different interpretations of what that goal should be, by the way. We should talk about that. But that's the way I define it. I think that's the way our working group, not all of us, some have more militant, more extremist views within our group. I'll tell you that honestly. Destruction of Russia, for instance, that's not my view. But I think the goal of sanctions is, or should be, at least, stopping the war. And obviously that hasn't happened. So at the first cut, are sanctions working? The answer has to be, at this stage, not yet, in terms of that goal. Oftentimes people flip right after they say that, and they say, sanctions aren't working, so why are we doing it? And I just want to be categorically clear. I find that a non sequitur to the answer to the first question. Because the counterfactual is, well, we shouldn't have done anything. Well, that would be, I think, morally wrong, first and foremost. I think you had to do something. And what's the alternative to not doing sanctions, right? You have to have an answer to that. It's not sufficient, in my view, just to say, well, they're not working, so we should lift them. And the other piece I would say to that is, Russia's a big economy. Sanctions take a long time to work. In terms of the long-term objective, it's going to take a long, long time. We passed and I think it's the last one, I haven't checked recently, but I'm pretty sure it was the last major multilateral UN Security Council resolution, sanctions against Iran. We passed that in May 2010. I was in the working at the White House at the time. Big achievement. I worked, that was a big chunk of my life back in 2010 to get to that UN Security Council Resolution 1929. I still remember the number. And it took years before negotiations began. And it took even longer to get an agreement to the JCPOA. Now, let's leave aside whether you think that was right or wrong goal, but that was the president's goal, without question, to get the JCPOA. And sanctions were an instrument, one of many instruments, not the only one, to try to achieve that objective. And we did, but it took years to do with an economy much smaller and much more constrained in terms of the international system than Russia today. So nobody should be surprised that 8 months in, we haven't seen the kinds of things that we would like to see with respect to this instrument of stopping Putin's growth. But second, are sanctions getting us closer to the objective? That's a different question. And there, I would say it kind of depends on what you're trying to measure. And here, I really am interested in the expertise in this room because I'm not an expert. But what I do see in the debate is different people focus on different metrics that they're concerned about, right? So everybody likes to focus on GDP numbers, right? Because that's one we can all understand and focus on. And if you use that, then sanctions have achieved some objectives, not nearly what we wanted, but if you look at the estimates year to year, most certainly the numbers are going in the right direction. If you look at individual sectors of the Russian economy, you see even greater results. So like the automobile sector, giant impacts in terms of sanctions influencing what is happening in that economic sector. But I would also just repeat, big economy and interdependent in one very specific part of the global economy, that being energy. And there, I would just say, we've seen, including with the price cap, reluctance from the global community to do things that would actually affect those numbers in ways that we would like. So we published a paper on the price cap, by the way, a couple months ago, and we've been interacting with all G7 countries for months. Some might even say that the idea came from our working group. I would not say that. But certainly we're in, and we had other scenarios, by the way, a tax, export tax, excise tax, different things. They landed on the price cap, but we want to, our folks thought $30 a barrel was where you should be, and they're at $60 a barrel. And that, I think, just shows you that sanctions are a two-way street, and this is where I want to stop and reflect. What does that mean when we think about China, given what a much harder lift it would be to do anything vis-a-vis that economy? But digging a little deeper, I think we have reason to believe, and this is classified and hard to trace, and so because we're on the record, I'm going to be careful. But I would put it this way: it is most certainly the perception of the U.S. government that controls on certain critical technologies has had a debilitating effect on Russia's ability to conduct the war they want to. I don't have the details of that. We can talk about it maybe in questions about what we know and what we do not know. But we think so. And the fact that Russia is relying on other actors and third parties to try to replenish those critical technologies, sometimes doing it in ways that are illegal in terms of United Nations sanctions, suggests that part is having an effect. Third, are individuals affected by sanctions? That is without question, because I hear from them every day. If you're on the sanctions list, you don't want to be there, and I'm talking about Russian oligarchs as well as American business people, and that shaming effect. For some it's real money, for others it's a reputational cost. I just talked to an American last week who resigned from the board of a company in Russia, And the main reason he did it is he wants to be invited back to his Stanford, reunion. I shouldn't have said that on the record. But that, without question, those people, if you're on the list, you don't want to be on the list, and you don't even want to be on the list of non-governmental entities like ours or Navalny's group that are recommending you get on the list to the other countries. The problem, of course, is that translating that into influencing Putin is a big problem. I'm going to get to that when I talk about mechanisms in a minute. And then finally, I would say on things, real impact. I've lost track, but I think we're up to 1,200 companies, including almost all the major American companies, have left Russia. Most of them did not have to. Most of them were reacting to the kind of long-term trajectories about, their futures in the country. But that in the long term, hard to measure immediately, I think will have a devastating effect, impact on the Russian economy. And that is because of the sanctions regime more generally. Could we do more as a world? The answer to that, of course, is yes. We have several papers talking about it. Let me just get through what I think are the big ones. The sanctions on finance, on the banks, way too porous. The Russians have figured it out. We got to clean that up. Greater sanctions on Russian military enterprises, way too many holes there. Third, as I already said, the price cap is too high. Fourth, we believe, and this was a very controversial paper we published several months ago, that Russia should be designated a state sponsor of terrorism. That has big implications in terms of what you can do with Russian officials and Russian entities. But if you want to have a big bang, and we believe it is time for a big bang because the sanctions have kind of petered out in terms of focus, you could do that. Fifth, seize the CBR assets. That to me is low-hanging fruit. And I know the arguments about what implications that has for the global economy and American reputation. I'm happy to talk about those things, but to me, that's Russian government money sitting in Western banks. We should transfer that to the Ukrainians. Sixth, a big messy world that I'm not an expert in, but I've gotten very involved in, including with interactions with local companies here. But our view is that there's actually there's no such thing as a non-dual use technology anymore. WhatsApp is a dual use technology. WhatsApp is being used by Russians to kill Ukrainians. So why is it not considered a technology that we should be trying to disrupt? We spend a lot of money with rockets and HIMARS to take out, other kinds of communications. Why are we not focused on that? And I could go through the list, Microsoft software, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, in various different ways. But that whole space, we've done some good things. And by the way, some of those companies have done some good things. I want to give them credit, but I don't think we've done nearly enough in terms of trying to disrupt their communications, including their propaganda techniques, both within Ukraine, in Russia, and around the world. Last thing I'll say, maybe I'll skip mechanisms of sanctions. Should I not? What do you think is important? All right, let me just say one word about it. And I remember the long debates that we had about this with respect to Iran when I was at the National Security Council. I think there's a misconception, not in this room, but in the wider sanctions debate. And it goes something like this. There's all these oligarchs with all this money and all their yachts. So we're going to sanction them. We're going to take their yachts, and then they're going to get really pissed off and go back to Moscow or drive across the street to the Kremlin and tell Putin, Vladimir, they took my yacht. You got to end this war. That's not the way I haven't been to Russia for a long time because I was on the sanctions. I got on their sanctions list in 2014. So I haven't been there for 8 years, longest I've ever been outside of that country since I went there first in 1983, but so sanctions affect me personally, by the way. But that just doesn't work that way, because the oligarchs, to oversimplify, but we can get into details if you're interested. I know a lot of these people, or I used to know them, and I'm still in touch with some of them. Those most exposed, those individual billionaires most exposed to sanctions are also exactly the oligarchs that have the least amount of pull, right? They're the ones in London. They're the ones with global companies. They're the ones that made their money mostly in the 90s and then figured out a way to make peace with Putin in the 2000s. The Alpha Bank guys are the kind of poster child for this. Freeman and Oven, they left in 2014. They live in London. They've invested $30 or $40 billion outside of Russia since then. They're on the sanctions list, and we think, or some people think, that because of that, Oven and Friedman can then tell Putin to stop the war. But they're exactly the kinds of people that Putin doesn't care about. And when those people have their yachts seized, I think Putin cheers. And yet we think we've scored some great victory in the sanctions thing. And conversely, the oligarchs closest to Putin are people that make their money either through oil and gas or through domestic kinds of things, construction companies inside Russia. Those are the people closest to them and are the least affected by sanctions. And I think just that paradox, we have to understand. It's makes for a great photo op when we see a yacht being seized, but it actually, I think, is the least effective way to get Putin to change his behavior. And then, just to state the obvious, we're talking about a dictatorship. You go to jail for 15 years. In the case of Ilya Yashin, just on Friday, he's a Russian opposition figure. He said something about the war, and he was just sentenced for 8.5 years in jail. Navalny, likewise, is in jail trying to stop the war. He's doing that from jail, right? And as a result of that, his jail cell has gotten smaller and smaller as a result of what he said. And so that, the idea that we'll sanction them, they'll suffer, they'll go out onto the streets, I just think underestimates the coercive power of Putin his regime. Finally, and we'll talk about China maybe later, but in the long run, and I think about this in other things. How do you measure non-events? And I want to hear from people who think about this more systematically. I used to think about this in the first wave of sanctions. How do you measure the fact that Mark Andreessen will never, ever, ever go to Russia, right? Because that there's no way that, and I'm just using him as a metaphor for investors here. When I was trying to get them to go, that was part of my job back when I worked in the government. And he's like, well, that's ridiculous. That's idiotic. Why would I have 4,000 proposals right here on my desk? Why would I have to fly to Siberia? I'm using Mark metaphorically because I just realized, but I'm sure he would not disagree with anything I'm saying. But that's a non-event that's hard to measure when you look at the GDP numbers for 2023, right? How do you measure the fact that hundreds, maybe thousands of expats have now left Russia who were involved in, call it tech transfer, call it intellectual property, call it, and in some cases, ExxonMobil with Rosneft, it really was unique technological transfer that's not happening. Well, how do you measure its long-term impact on the economy? How do you measure the fact that, I don't know what the number is, but tens of thousands easily, maybe hundreds of thousands of really talented Russians have now left Russia? How do we measure that in terms of long-term impact on the Russian economy? By the way, it's having a positive impact on the Georgian economy and the Ukrainian economy. I guess so you can measure it because they're doing productive things now in exile. But I think these things will have really long-term negative economic consequences For Russia, how do you measure the fact that they can't get, the chips they need for their telecommunications companies? And it's not as easy, from what I've been told by people that own these companies, to just plug in Chinese chips when when you've been on a Western system for 20 years. And my intuition tells me, and my hope tells me, honestly, that these will have long-term implications, but I don't know how to measure that. And I think it would be good if we knew how to measure that. And finally, I hope people will talk about China. I can read it both ways, but I'm not an expert, so I want you guys to read it both ways.
Thank you very much. You've got as many things to think about, and I want to ask a little bit about the sanctions. There's a sense in which it can go the other way. Sanctions, limiting prices, it's all sort of anti-market. And you mentioned some at the end there. Well, maybe it's actually encouraging people to get around them in different ways. So that's a concern I have. It really is. Here we are doing something which is not our business, and we're advertising. Yes, maybe it's better than war, which it is. But it seems to me if there's a way, and we're seeing a little bit of the success of Ukraine. There's a little bit of that, and I'm reading about Iran. Maybe there's some protests on the other side of the government. So, is there a way that we can basically use your philosophy and try to go in another direction? That's my basic question.
I'm interested in your answer. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, John. The price cap debate for us was a huge controversial one within our group.
Maybe talk about that.
Well, just as it's a good example, but you're asking a bigger question. I mean, I would say half of our group didn't support the idea. For precisely, it's distorting the market, won't work, and I have no way. I'm not an expert in this. I have no way to measure that or predict that. I eventually went with the group that signed because we didn't have a better alternative. And so if you interact with Ukrainians every day like I do, it's not just a kind of abstract thing. It's like, you know what? You guys, the free world, this is what they say. You are sending billions of dollars to this dictator who is killing my family and literally, we just had a sanctions call last week, and half of the people on the call from Ukraine were using generators to be on the call. So how do you answer that question? Well, it's just the market. It's not my money. It's European money, and they just see it as you are helping to finance the war that is killing us. So do something. It's too early to know whether the cap. I mean, obviously the cap is not where we want it, so we probably will not.
We want it lower.
We wanted it 30. Yeah, we wanted, basically so they can cover their costs, but not. Well, there are different ways to look at it. It's both the taxes and the companies themselves. But we wanted to reduce their capacity to keep the war going. That said, there's a number of things that have happened already. So it's definitely market distorting, but is that good or bad? That's the question. So Russia's already having to sell, at a 30% discount because people don't want to buy it. If they can buy it somewhere else, they will. $30 a barrel discount. So that what percentage that is gotten bigger as the price of oil has gone down. That's a good thing. The target on these sanctions is the insurance companies and the banks and the shipping industry, right? So they're the ones that will be sanctioned if they transfer oil at a price higher than 60. That's pretty easy to do right now, but hopefully that will change over time. And so at least you're increasing the costs, doing things in a black market way, ships meeting out in the sea and transferring, that's at least increasing the cost to the Russians. So I see that as maybe a good thing. I think we also give an argument, but it's too early to, this is just the beginning. It really doesn't start to be enforced until January. I think the hope is it gives an argument to the Indians and the Chinese to say, well, we'd love to pay you more, but our relationship with the Americans is just too important to us. So this is the best we can do. So they're not going to formally say they're watching playing, but maybe informally we tie their hands, and that's a net gain in terms of our objectives. But I'd love to hear other views on the price cap.
Questions, Amy? You must have 10.
So I'll confine it to one because I want to hear what other people have to say. So you put a lot on the table, Mike, and thank you so much for coming. You said a couple of times, I hope we get to talk about China. So I want to focus on what you think the effect of Russian sanctions could be on China in two respects. Number one, we have war plans, right? Do we have sanctions plans in the US government so that we're anticipating what China could do, what our sanctions could be, how they're trying to sanction-proof their economy, number one. And number two, how do we think about what China, you and I have talked about this, what are the lessons you think China is learning from sanctions, and what are the lessons you hope China is learning from sanctions on Russia?
So with respect to the first question, I don't know the answer to it. I can tell you that in the run-up to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I was involved in lots of conversations with our government, pretty high levels from time to time. And I was in the camp that said, you should have a sanctions plan, which they said, of course we do, Mike. We're not a bunch of idiots. So presumably they have one for China. But I was in the camp that they should publish it ahead of the war. I wanted it to be published so that it could be clear for the cost-benefit analysis of Putin what the cost would be, and for other interlocutors in a way that might help to say this is too costly. And I lost that debate. I lost that debate. Many other people are having a debate. The explanation I got back from the White House was that if we did that, we would start a giant negotiation amongst all our allies about what should be in the sanctions plan. And we're really good at negotiating among ourselves to the least common denominator as the free world. And so they decided they couldn't afford to do that. So, but that's interesting. What should be the lesson learned for the China case? I still think, by the way, the other reasons I wanted them to publish it ahead of time is I wanted to tie their hands because, I wanted to, once they said they were going to do something, I wanted to make sure that they actually followed through. I was part of the sanctions debate in 2014. I left the government the day Putin annexed Crimea. So he waited till I left Moscow before he did that. It's not true. But because I still knew a lot of those people, I was involved in, those debates episodically. And there was the classic clash of those that care about the global economy saying, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't do this. And those, over at the Pentagon, literally Treasury versus the Pentagon to cartoonize it. They're all friends of mine. They fought. And then that meant that they didn't do as comprehensive things as was the first blush out of the White House, right? So if the first blush you could publicize that, then you're going to make it harder for that debate internally to happen. So I think that would be a better way to proceed, but they chose the other way. What I hope they'll learn, and again, I'm not an expert on China, but follow this debate pretty closely. I mean, the economic implications of an invasion of Taiwan are orders of magnitude greater than, Russia and Ukraine. And I hope that they understand that we all go down together. Like it's, we measure this in trillions of dollars, that your economy is affected, our economy is affected, the Taiwan economy is affected. By the way, military guys aren't going to run those chip companies that Admiral Ellis and I visited in August. This notion that they're going to come over and take over and have all these things running, that's complete fantasy. I think that should get a lot more public attention too. What happens at TSMC the day they think they're about to be invaded, but that's what I hope. You've rightly phrased it. I don't know the way they're thinking about it, because the negative lesson they might be learning is just what we were talking about with the oil price cap, right? It's like, well, look at these feckless free worlders. They can't even do something as simple as this with effect. How are they going to take on us when they're all intertwined with us? So that could be the opposite lesson that they're learning. I don't know. Other people who know China better might have some thoughts on that.
We don't phrase the China question properly sometimes. Chinese are learning what they could do offensively, not what they have to defend against. The Chinese position on Taiwan is one of economic coercion and diplomatic coercion, which is underway and has nothing to do with 2027, 2049, and other irrelevant dates. So they look at this to see what they could apply in their current economic coercion against Taiwan. We tend to think of them as, oh, they're in a crouch and they have to defend. Should we that's silly, excuse me. So I was in a conversation with business people who are still investing in China. They were preparing for China to roll out offensive techniques derived from the lessons that they understand. Whether they get it right or not, an issue I have no idea. So that was just a two-finger on the China-Taiwan thing. They're learning to apply rather than to defend. On the sanctions point, Mike, which I'm sure your group discusses this all the time, so this is not two fingers, but maybe 3 or 4. That's okay. I'm looking at the leadership to make sure that's okay. The argument about the regime is always that sanctions destroy the opposition to the regime and reinforce, strengthen the regime itself. For all the obvious, the state economy gets more important than the private sector, and the private sector, by the way, lives in Yerevan, not in Georgia. The vast majority of Russians are in Yerevan, which is now the second largest per capita IT after Silicon Valley in the world. Is Yerevan, Armenia, and they're not really mostly Armenians, they're Russians. And so the issue is, Mike, do we get perverse and unintended consequences, at least in the short and medium term, by making the regime stronger, by those beneficiaries are precisely the ones you described, victims are precisely the ones you described, farther away from the pot, because the regime has two things in play. One is mystique, and the mystique is gone. He undermined the mystique. There's no mystique anymore that he's some type of widely operator, some type of strategic genius, that he knows what he's doing. That mystique is gone. It can't come back. Same with Xi Jinping. Mystique is over. But the other piece of these regimes is dependency. They're all dependent on the ruler. Against the others who are in the regime, who are fighting them, the infighting, against the international sanctions, against all the things that you know, the ability to transact in the international system. And so have we increased the dependency? He's destroyed the mystique. The war increased the dependency, not us at the beginning. And then we reinforce that. So that would be the argument. I'm not making that argument in a positive sense. I'm making it in devil's advocate. I'm sure you've discussed that. What would be the opinion of the group that you're in on that point?
Well, that's not devil's advocate. I think that's an analytic statement. I mean, what you just described is true. Whether it's good or bad is where the debate takes place. But there's no doubt that space for the independent economic actors in Russia is smaller today than it was 8 months ago. And remember, all those 1,200 companies leaving, they're divesting and basically handing over their assets for nothing, right? Think of McDonald's as the classic one, but they're all doing that in ways that this makes this, they're either the state takes over or people close to Putin take over. So that in the short run is not a good outcome as far as I'm concerned. I just don't know what the better alternative was. Right? I mean, that's the debate, right? So when you, and we, by the way, we have Russians in this group. We have Russian economists. Sergei Guriev is a member of this group, and just so you know, there's like tensions between Ukrainians and Russians on this stuff. I mean, I skipped over liberal opposition and exile is, between a rock and a hard place. They're the biggest losers, and they're, we're seeing numbers of people going back to Russia because they have no options in the West, right? So that's no good. And by the way, that's a footnote, I would say, and this relates to China too. Our policy to attract the best and brightest, to get them to come to our country, to put it really blunt, is completely broken. I deal every single day. I'm not every single day with trying to help some Russian get to a safe place that they can stop, helping Putin's war and stop helping us. And same in China, right? All these people that have left, they should be here, and they're not. But that's for somebody that I'm not an expert on that. I feel that every single day. I mean, there's even this guy in Belarus is Belarusian in exile. Is just to set up a company because he runs a tech company here that will just help with visas because the U.S. system's so screwed up. You guys should do another session on that someday, and you should invite him. He's a local guy. I'll put you in touch. Really fascinating just to listen to him talk about our short-sightedness on those things because of our politics. But I don't know what to do. Like, I think that's right, and I don't know what the alternative would be other than no sanctions. And then, well, I don't know. I think I guess I come down on, I don't want anybody. I mean, there's a kind of even a philosophical debate that I've had with some Russians. If you are paying taxes to this regime, aren't you helping the regime? And even if you're a private sector company, if you're giving that, at a philosophical level, are you helping this barbaric, genocidal, worst war in Europe? All the adjectives in place. And I guess philosophically, I think you are. But I do not try to judge people in those positions. Those that have chosen to stay or those that are in exile. In other words, I don't have a good answer to your question, Steve. I think I'd be curious what other people think. I don't know what the right answer is.
Let me ask you a quick. You're a farmer. You're doing terrific contributions, as you say, talking to people, maintaining your contacts, and we thank you for that. What you're not there. So you're a different mode of operation. And there are other people like you who are not there, a different mode. Is there more that maybe Stanford or universities or the private sector? You mentioned that this group is a private sector group. It wasn't created by government at all. So is there more that we could be doing? I'm seeing a lot of military people. I was in the military. Lots of connections, and we know how things work. But we don't really reach these other points of view very much. Is there more that we could be doing based on your experience?
Well, you could give us money. No, I'm just kidding.
No, besides that, even ideas.
I mean, honestly, I was just talking to both the U.S. government officials and Ukrainian officials. This stuff is not institutionalized in either place. The intellectual capacity, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way. I'm on the record, but I know these people. They don't have at the State Department, at Treasury, at the White House, and the White House just lost their main point person. He just left. Like, a bunch of people are leaving after the elections, the author of the price cap, arguably, just left. They don't have a lot of capacity, I would say, to think about these things, and so that's something we should wrestle with. But we're really, this is a really imperfect substitute, and the Ukrainian government even worse. I would say they don't have a systematic way to think about sanctions. They're toying with some governmental changes, and that's something where maybe we could give them help. There's a related piece to it, John. Don't want to get ahead of our skis, but the same people that are working on the coercive part right now in the Ukrainian government are eventually going to be the people that work on reconstruction, and that we should talk a little bit more systematically. That is a place where we have a lot of expertise, a lot of historical knowledge, and I think that, again, I don't see the place in the U.S. government or the EU or, London where I interact with these folks kind of off and on. That would be a place we could do more. The other thing I would say, just as you said, I'm a former, the other thing that's hard about this work is it's adversarial to most of the governments we're talking about, right?
Because you were in the U.S.
Well, no, the Biden administration doesn't like it when I go on TV and say the Biden folks have not declared Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, and then Nancy Pelosi, she was at one of my talks. She said, "Well, that's a great idea," and then so she takes it to the Congress, and actually, there's a lot of support for that there. You can imagine if you worked in the administration, you don't really like that. They don't like the fact that we put out a paper saying their target number was twice as much as it should be. And so that's a complicated, space. But I think our attitude about it, and this goes for the Ukrainians and the Canadians and the Europeans. I'm focused really a lot on America, but I want to keep reminding everybody that the Americans are not the majority of our group. I would say probably the Ukrainians are represented more than others. Our attitude is let us think outside the box, bigger ideas that give you the space eventually to get to them. And I would say that's happened a lot. If you think about our first paper to where we're now, the things we said in March were considered crazy. And now, by our count, governments have done 70% of them.
One thing is on my mind. Where's it going to go? I know you're not in the business of forecasting, but it looked good for Ukrainians until recently. Now it looks bad again. Do you have any sense of? We're doing a lot. At least I read we're doing a lot. Is there more that the U.S. or where do you think it's going? What can we do that is constructive based on what you see it's happening?
Well, we should ask Ambassador Pfeiffer maybe too. I bet you he has some ideas.
Anybody can jump in.
Let me take a first guy. So first on the analytic part, then the prescriptive part. And of course, what I want is for the Ukrainians to push the Russians out and for them to gain their borders, 1991 borders. That should be obvious. That's what I want. What I see is after these incredibly successful but very costly offensives this fall, that I see a settling in on both sides where neither side has the capacity to move the basic borders from where they're now. And I wouldn't be surprised if a year from now, the borders hadn't really changed. That's it. Again, that's not what I want. That's what I see. And I see that for a couple of reasons. Is that one, the Russians have gotten more sophisticated about their defenses of what they have. I think most military people would look at what they're doing on the ground to see that. They're running out of stuff, by the way. That's good. If you got to rely on the Iranians and North Koreans, that says something about your industrial base. But our industrial base is also rather constrained right now. We don't talk about it, and we shouldn't. But if you watch, we're not giving them as much as we were before at the same rate. That's partially because we don't have those things in place. One thing I worry about is I think the military assistance is in pretty good shape. I think the economic assistance piece is the part that both in the United States and around the world, like $5 billion a year to the Ukrainians for basic support. A friend of mine's a senator, Senator Steve Daines from Montana. We were talking about Montana. He was my high school debate partner, John. Steve was he's on the Senate Banking Committee, and he's a supporter of the war. He was the first senator to go to Kiev. He doesn't get any credit for that. Maybe because he's a Republican, I don't know, but he was the first guy there. But he parsed the words very carefully. He said, I'm all for military assistance, but why should we be paying this when there's all these other countries around the world that should be? And my prediction is that that kind of argument is going to get louder and louder here in our country, and it's in other countries as well. And that's why I think, like, we got to be more creative about generating resources, economic resources for Ukraine, including the CBR thing, including even some more creative ideas about oligarch assets in return for getting off the sanctions list. That's an idea I have that nobody supports yet, but they're still in the mindset that these are all SOBs or evil people, and we're going to take their assets. I've been involved in some of this over the years in my government work, in terms of including those who tried to get their assets that were seized back in 2003 when Khodorkovsky was arrested. These people are still litigating today, 20 years later, to try to get their assets back. So I have an alternative idea. Rather than taking the Freeman and Ovens of the world to court. By the way, they got a lot of resources and a lot of smart lawyers. And by the way, philosophically, their argument is a lot stronger. We are private sector people living in a rule of law country. It's a pretty high bar to say we got to seize their assets. My alternative, which again has supported. I think I have 3 supporters in the entire world. So I got some work to do, is to give them a mechanism to donate, 30% of their value, maybe 50%. In return, they get off the sanctions list.
So we have a question over here.
Yeah, Mike, thanks so much for the presentation. This has been really fascinating. So I would love to talk more about the CBR assets. In particular, I guess you can kind of think about the cost of to what extent that might destabilize, dollars, reserve currency, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm kind of curious if you view kind of the benefits of potential seizure more in terms of sort of like the morality of sort of facilitating post-war reconstruction in Ukraine, or whether you think there would be really significant sort of domestic political implications, sort of how that would shape the course of the Putin regime going forward, and hence potentially also his military calculations in Ukraine.
Repeat the gist of the question for the online participants.
Yeah.
I should repeat.
I'm happy to restate as well. So I guess we kind of we've talked to some extent, not here but in other forums, about the costs in terms of potential destabilization of the dollars, of global reserve currency, et cetera. But how should we think about the benefits of CBR asset seizure? Are the benefits primarily in terms of post conflict reconstruction in Ukraine, or are there other potential positive externalities in domestic Russian politics?
Yeah. So
treatment calculations and the future.
So let me start with the kind of ethics, but I want other people to talk about the economic piece and the interdependence piece, right? And so we have $360 billion It's Russian government assets, right? So it's not individuals. And then they got a giant windfall because they invaded Ukraine. You know, it's in our paper here, but you know, billions of dollars more because they invaded Ukraine. So I feel pretty on strong ethical grounds that yeah, that money should be used to rebuild Ukraine, and my mother shouldn't have to pay for it. Putin should have to pay for it. To get back to Steve Daines, because he represents my mom in Montana. Why should my mom have to pay for reconstruction, but Putin doesn't, and the Russian government doesn't, because we're worried about the global financial system? That's on the moral grounds, right?
Very compelling.
Number two, though, here's the interesting thing about, you know, I'm thinking about the Chinese. Like, is it better or worse signal to them if we seize these assets? I think it's a good signal. Like, because they got a lot more money in our system. So they should be a lot more concerned that we might do the same to them if they invade Taiwan. Now, other people say, "Oh, they're going to take their money out." I mean, John, I want to hear what you think on this. But the conventional wisdom that this is a bad signal to all these people around the world that invest in the dollar. I'm like, if you're a good standing person banking, you got no trouble. But if you're a criminal regime, if you're a criminal, by the way, why do we even want you in our banking system? That's another question we should be asking ourselves, right? But B, shouldn't you be a little careful about your criminal behavior if all your money is tied up with us? So I could see it as actually a positive thing for deterring, you know, the worst case scenarios in Taiwan. But what are the but John, I'm curious. Okay, all right.
And I just jump in with two comments. One is to support Mike's point on seizing Russian assets. It's not only a moral argument, but it's difficult to me to see how any Western government, I mean, the West has committed to help Ukraine rebuild. How does the West go to their publics and say, we need you to raise hundreds of billions of dollars, while at the same time giving back Russia $360 billion? I mean, politically, that just doesn't work. And so I think there are lots of arguments, but at the end of the day, I think governments are going to be in a position where the politics are going to drive them to seizure that money, which is the right outcome. I also just wanted to agree with Mike's point about, I think we are now right on a course for a war of attrition that's going to go on for months and months and months. As much as I have seen some projections that say the Ukrainians may take Crimea by the end of next August, I'd like to see that happen. My guess is it's not. And what I worry about, though, is the longer the war goes on, the Achilles heel for the West is going to be, how do we maintain public support for this? And how do we go back to Congress every 6 months and say we need another $40 billion for Ukraine? At some point, it's going to get harder to do that, which is why I think it would make sense now for the administration to try to jam in some more weapons to the Ukrainians so that as the ground freezes, they in fact could take back some more territory, which is what's going to have the biggest impact on changing calculations in Moscow. But thus far, while I generally approve what the administration has done, and I agree that on the one hand, we want Ukraine to win, but we don't want a NATO-Russia war, I think they tend to come back down on the side of being a bit too timid.
And, you know, very concretely, there are some weapon systems that, you know, the ATACMS is the one that gets a lot of attention. Yeah. My sense, Steve, is they're still debating ATACMS, but maybe that's just a way to appease people like you and me. That they say they're talking about it, but they're really not. But their real focus, they don't want to give tanks, they don't want to give MiG-29s. Their real focus is on air defenses. Yeah. And that suggests they're locking into a defensive posture rather than these more offensive weapon systems.
Yeah, the argument for ATACMS is, I mean, the Ukrainians took the Gimlers, the 50-mile range rockets, and used them to great effect, both to target Russian command posts, but more importantly, to target Russian ammunition dumps, and really screwed up Russian logistics by forcing the Russians to move everything back. If the U.S. were to give the Ukrainians ATACMS, and even under the same proviso, say, we're not going to, the proviso is you cannot use them against Russia proper, Russia defined in its 1991 borders, they could use those to strike targets in Crimea, further back in occupied Donbass that they can't reach now, and force the Russians to move their logistics even further back. And I think that would have a major impact. And also, I tried this argument when I was in Washington last. If you gave the Ukrainians ATACMS with the proviso they could only be used against targets in occupied Ukraine, you could then put out the hint that if Russian indiscriminate attacks or other Russian bad behavior continued, you might lift that requirement. And perhaps that would introduce a certain degree of deterrence into the Russians. They would have to consider what would happen were the Ukrainians given free rein to use GMLRS and ATACMS against targets in Russian proper, because thus far we've seen the Russians seem to be really, really bothered by that. The small attacks that the Ukrainians have conducted on Russian territory seem to have generated big political worries in Moscow.
I agree. I was thinking about what other things we could do, because that was your question, John. I mean, the other piece, and Amy, this gets back to the conference you guys had here last week. I don't think because we're in this new moment in time, you know, about civilian, non-civilian communications. We should be doing all that we can to increase the effectiveness of the HIMARS and the that shoot these rockets, to increase their effectiveness of the ones that they have. And my understanding is we're not doing that. The Ukrainians are a lot better than the Russians, but the Ukrainians still do not have the intelligence, the technologies to help them be more accurate, and that's something I think we should give more attention to.
Thank you very much. This is terrific.
Thank you all.